Good morning, guys. Am I audible to all of you?
Yes.
And my screen
Good
is also
morning,
visible.
sir.
My screen
Yes.
is also visible, right?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Okay. So yesterday we have completed our basic ASP.NET Core concept syllabus, and from today onwards we are going to start our ASP.NET Core MVC. So today basically I'm going to give you a bit brief introduction, or you can say brief idea about MVC framework, right? So what exactly MVC? What exactly ASP.NET Core MVC? How you can set up your MVC in ASP.NET Core applications, right? What is model? What is view? What is controller? What is the role and responsibility of all these components, right? What you can write as part of your model? What you can write as part of your controller component, right? What you should not write inside your controller, what the responsibility of the view component, right? How you can design a model view controller applications in your MVC framework, why you should prefer to use this ASP.NET Core MVC over ASP.NET MVC framework, right? So all these things we are going to discuss in today's session. So let us start. So as you can see, this ASP.NET Core framework, right, which we are learning nowadays, it is nothing but it is one of the most popular or most demanding technology from Microsoft, and people are using this. It is getting more popularity among the developer, and it is also anticipated that in the coming future, it is also going to do lots more, right? On the .NET platform, ASP.NET basically, if you ask what is ASP.NET, basically it is a framework which we use generally to develop web applications, right? Web application not only means that MVC based application, also we can develop web services, right? The RESTful services. ASP.NET Core MVC is the robust framework for building online applications and APIs, right? Using that model view controller pattern approach. So what is model view controller approach? That is what we need to understand. So basically ASP.NET MVC, it is a framework which is implement model view controller design pattern. So first we need to understand what is model view controller design pattern. Then I will explain this ASP.NET MVC framework. So what is MVC? So anybody having any idea what is exactly MVC? Because you people are
Model
coming,
view control.
yeah, model view controller, that is fine. But what is exactly this MVC?
It is a design pattern.
Yeah, which type of a design pattern?
Architectural design pattern.
When you need to use architecture design pattern?
When we want to separate business logic from UI.
That is the responsibility, right? When you know that is what you need to separate, right? That is the objective of this design pattern. But when you need to decide, once you started developing the application, or before developing the application, or at what time? So basically there are different phases, right? When the
Before
new,
developing the
sorry,
before developing the application.
right? So before start developing, you need to decide what should be the architecture of your application, right? Without deciding the architecture, how you can say that I am going to use MVC design pattern or BM design pattern or any other design pattern? So before that, you need to decide. So MVC stands for Model View and Controller. It is an architectural design pattern, right? So model view controller, and it is an architectural design pattern, which means it is used at an application's architecture level. So you need to remember that MVC is not a programming language. Don't say that MVC is a programming language, MVC is a operating system, MVC is a framework, right? MVC is not a programming language, not a framework. It is a design pattern. So when we design an application, first we create the architecture of that application, and in that case, MVC plays an important role. If you want to, if you decide that I'm going to implement a model separately, view separately, controller separately for my application, then in that application I need to implement this MVC architectural design pattern, right? And this MVC architectural design pattern, it is not only meant for .NET framework, this can be used in other applications also, like Spring people, Java people, they implemented MVC design pattern. PHP people, they also implemented MVC design pattern. And in Microsoft .NET people, right, they also implemented this MVC design pattern. So it is not new to ASP.NET Core MVC, right? All before ASP.NET Core MVC, we have already ASP.NET MVC that is also implemented using this MVC design pattern. So basically, whenever you start going to develop any application, before start developing the application, first of all, you need to decide what is the architecture I'm going to implement for this application. And while you are deciding the architecture, then in that deciding moment, MVC is going to play an important role, right? If you decide that I'm going to follow this and this pattern, right? So means the controller should be there. Controller should decide how the model is going to work with the database, whether I need to work with the model component or not. Then the controller will decide which views to be rendered, right? So that when the request comes, it will execute one view, and that view is going to be return some HTML content to the client who initially made the request. And if you decide you want to implement the architecture like this, then you can go with this MVC design pattern. So the point that you need to remember, C Sharp, PB, all these things are your programming language, right? C Sharp, F Sharp, these are your programming language. But that means MVC is not a programming language. So don't say that MVC is a programming language. MVC is not a framework, right? ASP.NET Core MVC is a framework. ASP.NET Core Web API is a framework. ASP.NET Core MT is a framework, right? So ASP.NET Web App is a framework, but MVC is not a framework. And what is MVC? It is a design pattern, right? So what exactly this MVC design pattern is basically, so basically whenever you need to use or whenever you need to implement the MVC design pattern, right? So basically MVC design pattern is basically used whenever you want to develop some interactive applications. Can anybody tell me what do you mean by interactive application? Can anybody tell me what is the interactive application?
Applications which can interact easily with end users.
That means if I'm developing one website using HTML, then in that website also the end user can interact.
So
Based on some user input, some events will happen, and we can control the series
Exactly.
of
So
events.
basically, if you are taking some input from the user, processing the input data, right, and the database is involved in that application, then that is nothing but your interactive application. Interactive application means here there is user interaction involved, and based on the user interaction, some event handling is occurred, right? So basically, what I can say, right? Suppose you want to create one application where you want the user to enter some data, product information, and you want to save that data into the database. That means here user interaction is involved. User needs to provide the product info. What is the product name? What is the product description? What is the product price? Number of quantity available, right? Discounted price. Then some images of the product, right? And then whenever the user click on the save button, then at that time your application needs to take the data from the user, right, from the client is nothing but your browser. Then it will process in the sense, in that case it will check whether the data is valid or not, whether the amount is entered is greater than zero, the discounted amount should not be greater than the actual amount, right? After doing all this kind of validations, then he will and save the data or save all this information into the database. That means here the user interaction is involved. And whenever the user provide click on the submit button or save button, some event handling is occurred. Event handling means some processing logic is occurring, executing, and then as part of the processing logic, so you can take the data from the UI, you can validate the data, do whatever calculation you want to do, and then finally you are going to save the data into the database. And guys, one more thing, in use interactive application is not meant that it is only a web kind of application. You can also create a desktop application, right? One desktop UI is there, and there you will ask the user to do some provide some input, right? So basically Windows Form application. This is you can also design Windows Form application as an interactive application. So interactive application doesn't mean it is only a web application. Interact application means the user interaction is involved, and based on the user interaction, some event handling is occur, right? So you can develop such kind of applications using MVC design pattern. So that means MVC design pattern is not meant for only web-based application, but you can also use this MVC design pattern in desktop or mobile-based application where there is user interaction involved. Clear? Guys?
Yes, sir.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, sir.
So let us understand when this MVC design pattern is introduced, what is the objective, right? So MVC design pattern basically introduced in the year 1970s, right? And what is the objective of this MVC design pattern? The objective of this design pattern is separation of console. So what mean by separation of console? Now, if you are implementing MVC design pattern in your application, guys, give me 1 minute. Right? So basically what it means if you are using MVC design pattern in your application, right? That means your application code is divided or it is separated into three important components. So what are the components? The components are model, view, and controller. So the main objective of MVC design pattern is separation of console, separation of a concern, or you can separation of a components, right? If you are not understanding what you mean by concern, so you can use the term separation of a component. That means whenever we are developing one application, we are creating the application with many different components, and this MVC design pattern will separate the development implementation of each component from other. That means the domain model and business logic are completely separated from the user interface, right? So what do you mean by this? Now, whenever you create any user interface, then there is the user text boxes is there, radio button is there, right? Drop down list is there, checkbox is there. So and you are having some model classes, right? And there is no link, no relation between the user interface and these model classes, right? So you can develop the user interfaces independently. You can, what I can say, use the model classes or domain classes, business classes independently, right? So that you can easily maintain the user interface. You can easily test the user, what I can say, the model classes and business logic, right? And whatever for a particular user interface, whatever model you want to use, you can use. You want to use a model 1, you can use model 1. You want to use a different model for unit testing, model 2 or mock model, that is also possible. That means the user interface component, that is the view, is completely separate, and the business logic, right? Whatever you are going to write for whatever the CSS class, so this business logic or business model or domain model is nothing but some CS class files. If you are using C# as the programming language, so those are also going to be completely developed independently, right? See, as if you are having any experience of a web form application, then you know that for each XPS file, there is a code behind file which is integrated with that file, right? And whenever you are having some control right button click on right element, then you have to write code inside the button click event only. But and in that case, your UI component is tightly coupled with your C# logic. But this is not in the case of a MVC design pattern, right? You can develop view independently, and you can use the model classes independently. How they are going to be developed independently, how we can unit test each component independently, how the application becomes more simpler and easier. Once you start developing the applications, then you will understand these things very clearly, right? So with this definition, so what we can say that MVC is an architectural design pattern that separate application code into three major components: model, view, and a controller, right? This pattern is helps to achieve separation of concerns. That means each component can be developed independently of other, right? Using this pattern, user request, right? So to give you a brief idea, right, how exactly MVC pattern is going to work, you can say in this design pattern, whenever a request sent by the client, whenever the request is sent by the client by using the browser, that request is routed to the controller. So actually it is not the controller, but you can say controller. Inside the controller, there is some action method. Those action method are only responsible for handling the request, right? So, but these action method are part of controller only. So it is better to use the word controller. So whenever the user send the request, that request is handled by the controller, and the controller is responsible for working with the model component. If the controller wants some data, right, then he will work with the model component. The model component will validate the data. The model component will process the business logic. The model component will work with the database, right? And once it from the user actions, right, it will retrieve the data from the model, and then it will hand over those model data to the PU. Or you can say the controller is only responsible for deciding which model components to be executed. The controller will only decide which view to be rendered, right? That means the controller is the component which is going to be handle the incoming request, and the controller is only going to decide which model is going to be used, which view is going to be rendered, so that the HTML response is generated, and then it will send the response, generated response back to the client who initially made the request, right? So to understand this concept of what exactly model, how exactly controller, and how exactly view is going to be work, right? Let us try to understand this with one example, guys.
I have
Key
one question.
concept. So yes.
So what exactly is business logic?
So business logic means suppose you submitted some data, right? You are having one form. In the form, you are deciding that product name is this, and product description is this, product images is this, product quantity is this, product price is this, products what I can say, product discounted price is this, and you want to save this data into the database. Can you save the data as it is? Or before saving the data, you need to do some kind of validations.
We need to do some kind of validation.
Validation, right? After doing the validation, right? See, what happened now? Sometimes some additional things you need to be add, right? Some additional things in the sense, if the company giving some 10,000, 10% discount, right? And you want to reduce that discount by 5%, and only you want to provide 5% discount to the customer. How you can do this? Is it possible to do this? Whatever discount provided by the vendor, I want to reduce the discount by 5%, and whatever the rate, that what I want to show to the client. Can you do this? Can you implement this logic in your application? Suppose the user enter the amount as 100 and the discount as 15%, right? User in the sense that vendor, right? And now what I want to show, I want to show the price as 100, but I don't want to show the discount as 15%. I want to show the discount as a 10%. Is that possible? Can you implement that logic in your application?
Yes.
This is nothing but your business logic. How you are going to implement? Right? So and then you need to, so suppose you want to calculate, so the amount is 100, and the user only enter the amount and the discounted percentage, right? Then you also need to calculate what is the selling price. Selling price is not going to be entered by the user. That you need to calculate at in your application. Yeah, this is the actual amount. The discounted amount is this. So according to this, right, what should be the selling price? And that's what I need to calculate at my application. And that information or amount I'm going to store in the selling price, right? So that whenever the data I'm going to display to the user for the selling purpose, at that time I'm going to show you that this is the actual price and this is the discounted price. Clear?
Okay, so does that mean that all the calculations or the backend processes that we do?
The business logic means all the validation logic, all the calculation logic, all the data access logic, that what you need to write to store the data into the database. This is nothing but your business logic.
Okay. And where does that go in the MVC? Does it go in controller?
That is the part of a model only. Controller is only going to decide which model components to be used, which views to be rendered. Controller is, see, that is what I'm going to discuss in now. What is the role and responsibility of model? What is the role and responsibility of views? What is the role and responsibility of controller? What you should write as part of your model? Is it good to write your business logic as part of your model? Is it right to write some logic inside the views, right? If not, then where we need to write? All these things we are going to discuss now, right? Okay, so let me first explain this concept, how exactly MVC design pattern work. Let me explain this model view controller components, right? Then if you are still having the question, you can ask me, because I have not yet completed the explanations. Right, once I complete the explanation, exactly what exactly this model view controller, where you need to write the HTML content, where you need to write the business logic, what exactly the responsibility of a controller, how they are going to be integrated together, right? Then if you are having any question, then you can ask me, guys. And one more thing, guys, now I'm going to explain how exactly this MVC design pattern work in ASP.NET Core with one example. But what I would suggest you, don't go with the code, right? Whatever code I am going to write, don't go with the code. Definitely in our coming session, I'll explain the code. But what I am trying to explain you the components, right? Try to understand the application flow, execution flow.
Okay, sir.
Right. So because if you go into the code, then you will not understand. Don't go with the code, whatever code I'm going to write now to show the example, but try to understand the components only. What exactly controller, what exactly view, and what exactly model, right? How the view, how the controller, how the model are created, right? Don't go with all these things. Only keep concentrated on the component, right? Definitely every code or whatever I'm going to write, I will explain in detail line by line. Suppose we want to design an application, right? We want to design an application where we need to display the student information, right? So I want to show what is the student ID, what is the name, what is the gender, branch, section. Simple one view is there, right? One web page is there. And in that web page, I'm going to display the student information. Any information you want, I'm taking a simple student example, product, employee, right? Any kind of as per your requirement, whatever you want to display, one report is there, right? So anything you want to display, you can display, right? Suppose I want to display this information on the UI, and what is my requirement? Now whenever I access this method, right, student details too, then this student information whose student ID 2 is going to be displayed in the browser. Then how is that right? And to display this information, I'm basically using this URL, right? Some port number, some domain name, then I'm passing the student details and it to from my browser. And when I pass this information, this UI is getting displayed, right? On the web page, this information is displayed. So how exactly this model view controller pattern works, right? This is the client. Client is nothing but your web browser. And from the client, you make an HTTP request. And whenever you make the HTTP request, then it is the controller of your MVC application, right? So as we are developing the application using MVC design pattern, definitely there is a component called controller. Definitely there is some component called model. Definitely there is some component called view. And whenever the client send the request, then it is the controller who is going to initially handle the request. The controller means what? It will going to control the application flow. What action method to be executed? What model to be executed? What view to be rendered? Every information is going to be decided by this component. This is the reason why it is said as controller. So you can say it is the brain of your application, right? So whenever the client sends the request to the controller receives the request, the HTTP request, this controller receives, right? Once the controller receives, then the controller will decide, right, what action method is going to be executed, right? So in this case, this student is nothing but your controller, and this details is nothing but your action method. So then the controller decide, yes, I need to execute the details action method, which is inside my inside this student controller class. So once the controller decide which controller and which action method to be execute, right? Then as you know, from the day one, I'm saying whenever we send the request, right? The request information you can access from anywhere using the context object. So in this case, from the URL, it is passing some route data, right? And this route data will be mapped to the controller action method, right? Inside this controller, there is a method, and that method means this request will map to that method. And whatever data you are passing here, that data will be passed to the controller action method parameter. How it is mapping from the URI to the action method parameter? There is a concept called model binder. That model binder will take the responsibility to mapping the incoming request data to the controller action method. That data might be your route data, that data might be your query string data, that data might be your posted HTTP form data, right? That data, if you are working with RESTful services, then you are having some request body. That request body data also it is going to map to the controller action method, and that is the job of model builder, model binder. We will discuss model binder in our coming session in detail. Once the controller start executing the action method, right? Then the controller will decide, do I need to execute any model, right? As in this case, I'm going to I'm going to display the student information on the browser, right? That means it should have the student data. How you will get the student data? So in that case, it is going to use or it is going to execute the model, right? It is going to execute the model component, and this model component is responsible for interacting with the database. It is going to execute the model component, and the model component is going to interact with the database. It will fetch the data from the database, and then once it fetches the data, again it will hand over the data to the controller, and the controller, once having the data, then it will pass the data to the view, right? And then the view render the student data, and once it is to render the student data, HTML file is going to be generated, and that HTML file is going to be returned as a response to the client. But while rendering the student information, it can also make use of the model directly, right? So you can see the controller can use the model component. The view can also make use of the model component. How the controller using the model, how the view is using the model. See, controller using this model to get the model data. But for displaying the model data, we also need the model. How it is, how the view is using the model, how controller is using the model. I will show you practically, right? And second thing that you need to remember, this model is independent, right? That independent means he doesn't know who are the other components using him. Controller using the model, view is using the model. That means controller having dependency on model, view having dependency on model. But this model doesn't have a dependency on either controller or on the view, right? So this is how it is going to work, right? So I will show you practically how this example work. But before that, let me tell you how you can develop these things, right? So for that purpose, what I'm going to do, I'm developing one application, right? So currently I'm using ASP.NET MVC template, right? ASP.NET MVC template. But what I can say, uh, but I will start you how to set up all these things from the scratch. But for to make you understand what exactly all these three components, I'm creating one MVC application, right? Okay, my application is created. What is the folder structure? I'm not going to explain at this moment, right? I'm just trying to make you understand what exactly this model view design pattern. So what is the role of a model? The model in MVC application represents the state of the application. So whenever I'm saying state of the application, state means what? State means the data, right? Whatever data required by your application, to represent those data, you need model component. For example, if I want to represent this student information right? That is the student ID, name, gender, branch, section, any other properties. I need a student model, right? Because this is nothing but your data. Data is nothing but your state. State means data of the application, you can say, or state of the application, you can say. To represent the state or data of your application, you need a model component, right? So the model in a MVC application represents the state of the application, also the business logic or operation it should perform. So, right, it is not only mean that you can only have the state of the, you can only have the model. You can have the business logic, right? Application business logic where you are going to perform some operations, right? The business logic should be encapsulated in the model along with any implementation logic for persisting the state of the application. What exactly? This is the most important point that you need to remember, right? So once you create the model, the work is not over, right? So if I'm creating the student model, my job is not yet done. What I will do with the student of model? I need to store some data, right? For storing the data, you need to work with the database only, na, right? To store the data. Suppose from the UI you are taking the data, student ID, name, gender, all these things. Then if you are not storing the data into the database, then what is the use of the data? For that purpose, for posting the data into the application, you need the model. That means if you want to interact with the database, then that data access logic should be as part of your model component only. But before storing the data into the database, we need to validate the data, right? We need to perform some operation on the data, right? So all these things are going to be implemented as part of your model component only, right? Second thing, if you want to use some kind of a view model, right? View model concept is there. That also I'm going to discuss what is exactly view model for a strongly typed view. Then also for representing the strongly typed view, you also need a view model. View model means for a particular model, for a particular view, you want to create a model that will combine the data of multiple model components, right? That concept is a little difficult to understand, but now I'm not going to explain what is view model, but you just remember view model is there, which is going to be used with the strongly typed view, right? So once you have the model, then what you need to do? So in simple word, we can say that model is the component in MVC design pattern that is used to manage the data. That is the state of the application in memory. The model represents a set of classes used to describe the application's validation, business, and data access logic. So see, model state of the model is going to manage the data. Model is going to represent the state of the application. But also the model is only responsible for doing the validation job, for doing the business logic job, for doing the data access logic job. Because all these things are, if you do not perform the validation, if you do not implement the business logic, if you do not have the data access logic, then what is the use of the model data? Right? So if there is no database, then what is the use of the data? We need to store the data into the database. For that purpose, we can go with the entity framework, we can go with the ADO.NET, whatever you require. Before storing the data, we need to implement some business logic. That is where we need to implement. We need to implement as part of your model. Before storing the data, again, we need to do some kind of validation, whether the amount which is entered by the user is greater than zero or not. Discount should be in a positive number, right? So any kind of validation that what you want, that you can also implement as part of your model component. Clear, guys? What should be there inside your model?
Yes.
Right. So let us implement for our application what we want. We want to fetch the data to display this on the browser. So for that purpose, what I'm going to do, I'm going to create one student model, right? By default, right, it is going to be created inside the model folder, but it is not mandatory. Wherever you want, you can create the model, right? So I'm not going to explain the code, right? I'm going to only create the model. So basically, I'm creating the student model. This is nothing but your student model. But as I mentioned, model means it is not only you can only create the what I can say class, but also you should have the logic, right? What kind of logic? Data access logic, validation logic, and business logic, and for that purpose I'm creating another class file. So another class file, in this case I'm creating one student business layer class file, and this student business layer class file having some operations, right? So in that case, for the student model object, I want to perform some kind of operations. I want to return all the student information. Then for that purpose, you need to create one method which is going to interact with the database and return the data. The implementation I have not provided here, but as we progress, then I will show you how you will interact with the database, right? Using ADO.NET Core, using Entity Framework Core, and how you can retrieve the data from the database, and how you can return the data to the controller, right? So in this case, this is the business logic layer, right? And here I'm writing the business logic. Not only business logic, right? Even though for data access logic, you can create another class, right? For interacting with the database. And that class instance you need to create here, and you just need to call the method. This method is going to return all the data. This method is going to return the state of data based on the ID. So currently, if you look at our example, we want to display the student details, right? Based on the student ID. So this is the method which is going to return the student details based on the ID. So in this case, I'm taking the student ID, right? And here I'm interacting with the database, calling the database, passing the ID. The database will return me the student information. Then I'm storing all the student information into a student object and returning the data. And here you can see insert, update, and delete method. Implementation I have not provided because that is not required at this moment. So insert means before here you need to write the data validation logic. You need to check whether student information, whatever is provided, is correct or not, right? Any conditional validation, Fluent API you can use, right? Data annotation you can use. Second thing is, once you have the valid data, then you want to perform some kind of a business operations, business logic. That is what you can put here. And once you implement validate the data, perform the business logic, right? Then you need to store the data into the database. For that purpose, you can make a call to the database, right? And the same in the case of update and delete method. So in this case, so as part of our model, we have created two classes. One class that is nothing but student to hold the data in memory, or you can say to represent the student data, and another one is student business layer, which is also as part of our model. And as part of the student business logic layer model, what we have done, we have written the data validation logic, we have written the data business logic, and we have written the data access logic. So this is the things that you need to do within a model component. Clear, guys? What exactly you need to write as part of your model? How to use that model in a view, how to use that model in a controller, we will discuss that things, right? But for now, if someone asks you what is model, model is nothing but it is going to represent the data in memory, right? As part of a model, right? We can create a set of classes, right? For storing the data, right? For representing the data, for validation purpose, for data access purpose, for business logic purpose, right? Everything should be there inside your model component only. Clear, guys?
Yes.
Right? So what is the logic I have written? That what I am going to discuss. What is enumerable student? What all this method? How you are going to perform? That is the separate story altogether that we will discuss separately. So once you have decided, once you have the model, then what you need to do, right? So before proceeding this, let me tell you in short, a model in MVC design pattern contains. Guys, give me 1 minute.
Hello. Hello. Hello, sir. I have one doubt actually. Are you able to hear
Pranaya,
me?
I think he went for something.
Okay.
Yeah, yeah. I'm complete. Yeah, so basically, let me complete this explanation, then I will take you out, right? So in short, we can say that a model in MVC design pattern contains a set of classes used to represent the data. In this case, this student class is used to represent the data, right? And logic to manage the data, right? And this logic means also whenever I'm saying logic to manage the data, that logic contains your validation logic, that logic contains your data access logic, and that logic contains your business logic. So basically that what you need to remember. Model means it is a set of classes used to represent the data, and logic to manage the data. And in our example, student is the class which is used to represent the data, and student business layer class is the class that is used to manage the data. Manage the data means it is validating the data and persisting the data into the database, and as well as business logic, right? You also write business logic. So this is the model component. Yeah, ask me your doubt.
Sir, it's not related to model. In architecture, you have shown me in that one, right? Controller to model, but it should be a dual, right? Bidirectional, right? Controller to model, model to controller. That will be happen, right?
See, this controller can communicate with the model. Model can never communicate with the controller. Then how it will be bidirectional?
Okay, I'm saying, like if we are something where if first controller will come from the view to controller will come, then controller to the it will come to the
View to
model.
controller means
So
what? View to controller. Say whenever the request comes,
uh,
request will come to
uh,
the controller only. Controller will
okay,
decide which model to use. And then controller will
correct.
render a view. That view is going to be generate the HTML, and that generate HTML will be sent back to the client. And to display the model data, it is going to use the model. Right, so this is the reason why I'm saying I am only explain this model component. Until and unless I'm not explaining this controller and view, you will not understand this architecture. This is the reason why
Okay,
I'm not given more focus on this diagram, right? More instead, I'm explaining what exactly individual components. Once these individual components are explained, then you will understand these things. So first of all, you should understand this model component, or what is model component, and who is going to interact with the database. Is that clear?
yes, sir.
Yes, that is fine. So if now someone asks you what is model, then you should have the ability to tell the answer. You should not hesitate. Model means it is a set of classes used to represent the data as well as logic to manage the data, right? Manage the data means what? Logic to manage the data means what? You should have the validation logic, business logic, and the data access logic to store and retrieve the data from a database. So this is the definition of a model. Next, what we are going to do? We are going to discuss views in MVC application. So views in MVC applications are responsible for presenting the content through user interface. So this is the important definition that is what you need to understand. Views in MVC application are responsible for presenting content through the user interface. That means currently whenever I open the web browser, then I'm able to see the data. I'm able to see the student information, and that information, right? How you are going to present the student data to the client, that is the responsibility of a view. View means it is going to render the model information to the user through the browser, right? So in ASP.NET Core MVC application, we can use, right, Razor View Engine, and that Razor View Engine is nothing but it is a mix up of your .NET code and the HTML markup, right? So as part of your view, you can write HTML code as well as you can write .NET C# code, right? And whatever the code we have written using .NET and HTML at the end, those are going to be converted into HTML only, and those HTML will be sent back to the client browser, and the client browser can show the whatever HTML statement you have written or generated HTML, whatever it should look, and that what the client is going to be seeing, right? There should be the point that what you need to remember is, So as we are using Razor View engine as part of a View, right? So we have the flexibility to write the C# code as well as HTML code. But as it is providing the flexibility to write the C# code, but that doesn't mean you should write any business logic or calculation logic as part of your C# code, right? So inside your view, you have to keep focus, right, on HTML part. As part of a review, you need to minimize the use of your C# logic, right? C# means only for displaying purpose, what is required, that is what you need to write, right? But you should not write any data access logic, any validation logic, any business logic, any calculation logic as part of your view. So view means it is basically used to render the HTML content, right? But as we are using MVC ASP.NET Core MVC, it is providing us the flexibility to mix up the HTML code with the C# code. As it is providing the flexibility to mix up, that doesn't mean we should write everything inside the view only using C#. In the view only, whatever required to render the data, model data, right? For that purpose, we can use the C# code. But for writing, but we should not write the business logic, validation logic, or calculation logic as part of your view. So practically, I will show you. So the view component in MVC design pattern is used to contain the logic to represent the model data as a user interface with which the user interact, right? So for example, we are having this a student model, right? So we create an instance of the student, and that instance store this information. So we want to represent the student data in the view, and that purpose we are using view. View component in MVC design pattern, right, is used to contain the logic to represent the model data. We are having the student model. How we are going to represent the student model, right? That is what so that the user can interact with the data. For that purpose, what we are going to use? We are going to use basic view. So basically, view is used to render the domain data. So whatever domain data, business data, or model data with you, that what you can render to the user, right? Render in the browser by using the component called view. For example, we want to display the student data on a web page. The student model carrying the student data. Then how it is going to render the student data? Let's see. Right. So for example, what I'm going to do, I'm having this home controller. Okay. So let me do one controller called, okay, forget about controller. So right. So inside this views folder, I'm going to create a folder called student, right? And inside the student folder, I'm going to create a view. Razor view empty, and I'm giving that view name as, see, what I'm doing, don't go with this logic, right? Because I will explain all this thing, what is view, how to create a view, what are the different ways to create a view, that what I'm going to discuss later, right? But now I'm just going to show you this is going to be your view component, right? So this is going to be your view component. So I have created the student model, and this is going to be your view component, right? So this, see, there's no link, right? So this model, it is there. So as this is the model, it doesn't matter who is going to this model doesn't care. But this details view, as you can see, it is using the model student or not. This view, in this view, I'm using the student model or not. I'm using the student class or not. Yes or no? So if you look at the student class, what is the namespace? Namespace is this is. And what is the class name? This student. And what is this? This is nothing but your model. And this is my view. Whenever this details.cshtml, this is my view. And inside this view, I'm using the student model or not. But for what purpose? I'm using the student model for rendering the student data, but not for writing the any kind of a business logic, data access logic, or validation logic, right? See, you can see here you are writing all these things inside the student business layer, right? Even though it is also possible to write the logic here, right? Suppose if you want, right? If you want, you can also write the logic here, right? Suppose what I can say, I can create an instance like this, student here. I can create, right? So what I can say, student business layer, right? Student business layer, right? Student business layer equals to new student business layer, right? And then using student business layer, I'm calling the get student get by ID. Is the name get by ID, right? I can call something like this. I can pass some ID, right? And here I can store the student data, right? And I can also use the student data here instead of using this, right? So this is possible here. If I want, then I can modify student dot, what is the student name? I can modify these things, right? I can do all these things. But I should not do all these things as part of your view. So you should not have any kind of a data access logic, any kind of a validation logic, any kind of a business logic as part of your view. See, if you want, you can write, but this is not the job of a view. What is the one and the only? Sorry? What, who is Jitendra Mahapatra? Anything? Why were on mute? Yeah. See, so in this case, see, as we are using Razor View Engine, we have the flexibility to write the HTML content as well as C#. So here you can see this is HTML content, and here you can see this is C# code, right? So both are possible. But what we need to write as part of your view? Only the you need to use C# only for rendering the purpose, right? Only for displaying the model content in the view. Only for that purpose, right? You need to use this C# code. For example, if the value is this and I need to display this, so these kind of things you need to use, or you need to write as part of your model component, right? You should not write any kind of validation logic, data access logic, business logic as part of your view, right? So you should not write all these things, right? So what you need to write as part of your view, you only need to write, you only need to use the model for rendering purpose, right? For rendering purpose means for display purpose, right? So currently this model, this view having the student model, and whatever the student data we pass to this view, that student ID, it is going to display. For displaying purpose, we are using the C# code, student.id, student.name, right? The model here, model is nothing but your student, right? So student having the ID property, you can access. Student.name property you can access. Student.gender you can access. So for a displaying purpose, for rendering purpose, we are using the model component inside a view. We should not use for any other kind of things, right? Because I saw many people are using this view for to do some kind of a business logic, some writing some validation logic directly as part of your view. So you should not do all these things, right? Clear? Now, if you go to the diagram, then you will understand this model component is interacting with the database, but this model, right, can also be used by the view. View is using the model for rendering the model data into the user in the browser. Clear? Yes? Any question?
Sir, at the rate model is a small letter in the inside
See,
visual, it is in capital M.
what I'm saying, don't go with the code. Don't go with the code. Whatever code I'm writing here, don't go with the code. Don't concentrate on the code. Consider this is a view only. And as part of the view, what you can do. So I'm writing the code, don't concentrate on that point at this moment. What is this small @ model? What is this capital @ model? All these things we are going to discuss, but not now, right?
Okay,
So
sir.
what I'm trying to tell you is this is the view component. What you can do as part of view component. As part of the view, you only need to write the logic, right, which is going to display the model data. You should not write any kind of a business logic, any kind of a data access logic, and any kind of a validation logic, even though that is possible, but that is not the responsibility of a view. The role and responsibility of a view is only to render the model content. And in this case, this is my student model. Whatever data is there, that is what I am going to render. I'm not going to modify the data, right? I'm not going to update the name. I'm not this view. It is not the responsibility of view to update the name or gender. It is not responsibility for the view to access the data from the database, right? So this is not the job of a view. View responsibility is only to render the model data. Clear? And for that purpose, it is making use of the view or student model. So if you look at this diagram now, then you will understand. You know what this model is interacting with the database, but this model is going to be used by the view component. Clear? This three piece?
So, own question. So can we have like
Yeah.
more than one view for a particular model?
In this case, I'm using this model, right? In this case, I'm having this view which is using student model. You can create another view which is also going to create the student model. No issue.
Okay, okay.
Right, but see, currently don't concentrate on those things. How many views I can create, how many controller I can create, can we access one view from a different action method whose name is not same. All these things we are going to discuss, right? But now just try to consider what exactly a view is in MVC design pattern. Clear?
Oh, yes.
Right?
I have one question.
Yes.
Yeah. So does the view interact with the model to get the data, or does the controller pass the data to the?
No.
Okay.
So what I told you, view component, view responsibility is only to render the data, not get the data from the database or from anywhere. Whatever data we will provide it to the view, it is going to render the data. But for rendering purpose, it is making use of the model component. Right? This is only using the model component. But what data this model component is going to be stored, that is what going to be provided by the controller only.
Can
So this
you
is
please
the
go to the figure?
right. So in this case, if you see what I have told you, I'm not going to write this logic. So this logic means it will get the data from the business logic layer, right? Student business logic layer. But I'm not going to write this logic here. This logic is I'm not going to write here. Now, if you go to this thing, right? So in this case, as part of this model, right? Don't see this model means what? It can have the model which is going to store the data, that is student model. It is also having the student business logic layer, which is going to have manage the data, right? Returning the data, working with the database, validation, database, and all these things. In this case, the view is only going to use the model for rendering purpose. So whenever I'm saying for rendering purpose means it is only using that the model, right, to store the data, right, so that it can display. But how to get the data, who will provide the data, that is not the responsibility of a view, and the view will not interact with the model to get the data. Clear?
So the data that will be displayed, it will be provided by controller.
Yes, 100%. It will be provided by control. How it is going to provide? How the controller? This is the reason why you can see it is having communication. This controller component can communicate with view, can communicate with model. So it is communicating with the model means it is communicating with the student business logic layer. The student business logic layer will return the data to the student this controller, and this controller once it get the student data, it will pass that student data right to this view, and this view having the student model, right, who can hold the data, and once it holds the data, then he can display the data like this.
So
Clear?
what is the purpose of that arrow from view to model?
Sorry.
What is the purpose of that arrow from view to model?
So in this example, this is our view. In this example, I am using this model or not?
Yes.
So how if there is no link, then how you can use the model? See, model means what I can say two things. One is model to represent the data. Another thing is model means the manage the data. For managing purpose, view is not using model. View is using model for displaying purpose, for storing the model data only. So in this case, view is never going to use student business logic layer. In this case, view is only going to student, because in this case, he has to hold the student data. Until and unless it is not holding the data, how you can access? For example, suppose in this case, right? in this case, if I create an instance of, right, what I can say, I create an instance of this class, right? And once I create an instance, I just call the get by IT method, right? And passing the value to. So what is the meaning? If I'm calling this statement, if whatever data is returning, if I'm not holding the data, then how I can use that data here? Is there any possibility that I can use the data which is written by this method? How I can use? If you want to use, then you need to hold the data or not,
Yes.
right? So similarly, this details action method, right? From the controller only, I'm going to provide the data. If I'm providing the data, then definitely if I want to use that data inside this view, I need to hold the data or not.
Yes.
Then how I am going to hold? For holding the data, in this case, as you can see, in this case, whatever this data is going to be written, for storing that data, I need to make use of the student model or not,
Yep.
right? So this student model, once you hold, then whatever you want, you can do. Similarly, if I'm not having the student model here, then how I can hold the data? Is there any possibility? Is there any other way? If you do not have this statement here, right, then how you can hold the student data, right? How you can hold the student data? And if you do
Can
not
we
have the
just not
student data,
use view bag, sir?
sorry,
Can we just not use view bag and view data, some kind of
right?
dictionaries?
See, if view bag and view data, uh, we are going to discuss. But do you think that view bag and view data are safe? Are they going to give you any intelligence? Are they going to give you any compile time error?
No, no.
Then what is the purpose of a view bag and view data? If you are having small information, right, then you can store them and you can pass them. But if you are having thousands of what I can say data, then in that case, what you will do? 100 of properties are there inside a model. Then what you will do? And it is also not suggested to use view data and view bag and temp data. Why that? What we are going to discuss. But in this case, this view using the model component only for storing the data, right? And that is what I'm trying to make you explain. See, in this model component, definitely this is the student model. So this component is independent. It can be used by controller. It can be used by view. And what is the purpose of the student model means? It is going to represent the student data. It can represent the student data anywhere. You can say inside the home controller, I'm using the student model. Inside the business logic layer, I'm using the student model, and inside the view also, I'm using the student model. Why? Because its main objective is to represent the data. If you want to store the student information, then you need the student model. Right? Clear, guys?
Yes, clear.
Right. So this and model, don't think that in this case, the student business logic layer it is going to use. It is only going to use the student class, not the business logic layer. And you should not write any other additional logic, right? Only rendering purpose, whatever is required to display the student data, that is what we are going to do. See, in this case, I'm writing model.student ID. So whatever student data we will pass to this view, that ID it is going to display. Nothing else, right? And you should not have right. You should not write any logic here to modify the student ID, right? To update the student name. Those kind of things should be avoided as part of your view. Only what is required for rendering purpose, that is what you need to write. Clear, guys?
Yes, sir.
Right. So next what we are going to discuss is control. So we have discussed what is model. Model means it is going to represent the state of the application. That is whatever classes required to hold the data, that classes, as well as it is also having classes to manage the data. right? Classes means whatever business logic, validation logic, data access logic required, that is going to be part of your model, right? And whatever model you create to represent the data, that same model can be used inside a view, because in the view, if you want to represent the student data, then you need student model. If you want to represent the employee data, you need employee model. If you want to represent product data, then you need product model. And but as part of the view, right, as we are using markup Razor View Engine, we have the ability to write both C# as well as HTML code. But as part of C# code, we should not write any kind of business validation logic, data access logic, and all these things. Only the logic which is related to render the model data, that logic you need to write. Clear, guys? These two piece of information: what is model and what is view. Because why I'm saying, because people are using, right? People are directly writing business logic inside a view only. This is not the good programming approach. The next important component, or you can say the heart of the MVC design pattern, is controller. That what we need to understand. So controller in MVC design pattern are the component that handle the user interaction, work with the model, and ultimately select a view to render. So what it means, now whenever the request is sent, then that send request is going to be handled by the controller. Actually, inside the controller, we are having some method called action method. That action method is going to handle the request. And while it is handling the request, it will work with the model, right, to get the data. Ultimately, it will also select a view to render the model data. In MVC application, the one and only responsibility of a view is to render the information. So in this case, if you look at the view, what is the responsibility of this view? Only to render the data. There is no such logic, no, nothing else. There should not be any validation logic, business logic, data access logic. No logic should be there, right? Only rendering logic should be there as part of your view. That is what I'm mentioning here. In MVC design pattern, the one and only responsibility of a view is to view render the information. The controller handle and responds to user input and interaction, right? And the controller is the component which is going to handle the user input and interaction. You are entering some data, clicking the submit button. The controller is going to interact. You are clicking on a button, you want to redirect to a different page. The controller is going to handle that interaction, right? So the controller is initially the entry point and is responsible for selecting which models type to work with and which view to render, right? So that means the controller, you can say, for user interaction, the controller is the entry point. The controller will select which models type to be worked with. The controller will select which view to be render. As it is doing all these things, right, from the entry to the exit, the controller is responsible for selecting the model to the view. So as it is handling everything, so its name is given as controller, right? And it is the heart of your .NET applications, right? Or you can say MVC design pattern. So in ASP.NET Core MVC application, a controller, if you are using C# language, then it is nothing but a .cs class file only, which has some methods, right? Which has some method called action method. So basically, action method means any public method you define, that will be the action method, public method. Right? If you created any method as private protected, then those are not said to be action method. Only the method which are public are said to be action method, and those methods are only going to be executed as part of your request, right? Whenever you are sending the HTTP request, if the method is public, then only it is going to handle the request. If it is not public, then it is not going to handle the request. So when a request comes to the controller, it is the controller action method going to handle those requests, right? That means the controller is the component in MVC application that is used to handle the incoming HTTP request based on the user action. The respective controller will work with the model component. The respective controller will select a view to render the information, and then once the view is executed, some HTML code will be generated, and then it will send those HTML generated code as a response back to the user who initially made the request, right? And the user browser, that HTML response will be rendered, right? The HTML will not be rendered. Whatever the UI interface, right? It should looks like as per the HTML content that interface will be rendered. So a controller is the component that will interact with both models and views to control the flow of your application execution. Right? Let me explain this with one example. Now I'm going to create a controller with the name student. So basically it is a class. Right? Let me create a class file student and every controller should end with the controller name student controller.cs and it should be reside in controllers folder. That's a separate story altogether. That is what we are going to discuss next, right? So we have the controller now, and you can say any method which is declared as public, that will be action method. So in this case, this details method, it is the action method. And this action method, whenever we send a request to student/details, right? This details action method is going to be executed. And as part of the action method, right? Once it receives the request, right? Once the action method is executed, then what will happen? Right? Then it will work with the model component. It will get the data. It will select a view to render the model data. So in this case, you can see this is student business logic layer. So I'm calling this student business logic layer. I'm calling this get by IT method, right? And then I'm handing over the student model to a view. Which view in this case? In this case, to the details view, right? Details view, which is reside inside the student controller, right? Or that is a complete story altogether. We will discuss how it is selecting the view, how we can create how you can select view based on some condition, right? How we can access a different view from a different action method. All these things are possible. We will discuss them separately. But for now, let's assume that in this case, it is going to execute the details view what we just created. So in this case, as you can see, we are working with the model component. Yes, this is the student business logic layer as part of your model. The student class is also as part of your model. So we are getting the student information, right? The controller will decide which models to be used, and accordingly, it will call the respective method and get the data. Once we have the student information, we want to use this. We want to pass this student information to the view only. So in this case, this return view is nothing but it is calling the view component. It is calling a view. It is rendering a view. Which view in this case? In this case, this details view. But while calling the view, whatever the student data with it, with this controller action method, it is passing that student data to the. Now, if you go to the action method, now, if you go to the diagram, then you will see controller work with the model component. Yes, controller working with the model component. These are nothing but your model calling the business logic layer, calling the get by IT method. And once it return the student information, we are storing that in the student model, right? So controller working with the model. Once the controller work with the model component, right, it is not needed or it is not mandatory that always the controller is going to work with the model. It is not mandatory. Right? If it is required, then it will work with the model component. And once it works with the model component, then it will select a view to render the data or to display the user interface, right? And in this case, for that purpose, it is using the view method. And to this view method, right, if you are having some model data, you can pass. If you do not have any model data, then also you do not need to pass, right? For example, I'm going to create another action method, right? And another action method. So in this case, you can see I'm not what I'm doing. So in this case, I'm doing these things, right? So in this case, you can see in this case, right? In this case, this is also an action method. This action method can also execute as part of your user request. Whenever the user sends a request for student/index, this action method is going to be executed. But this action method doesn't work with any model component. This action method doesn't pass any model data to the view, right? So it is not mandatory. But if you are working with the model, you can work. If you want to pass the student data, you can pass, right? Even though if you work with the model, it is also up to you. If you do not need to pass the student data, right? So what you can simply return this, Right? In this case, you can see it is working with the model, but it is not passing the model data to the view. So it is completely depend on your business requirement, whether to work with the model component or not. Whether to work with the component, if I'm working with the model component, then do I need to pass the model data, right? Any data to the view or not? That is completely decided based on your application requirement, right? So for this particular example, I'm not going to discuss these things, right? So I'm going to remove this one. I'm also going to remove this one. But in this case, it is working with the model component and it is handing over the model data to the view. So this is what you need to understand. Controller can work with the model. Controller can select a view to render the HTML content, right? And once the HTML content is generated, then that generated response will be sent back to the client, right? Now, if you run the application, right? So we have discussed the controller, we have discussed the view, and we have discussed the model. So now, if you run the application and if you visit student/details, right? Then this is the controller action method, right? That is going to handle the HTTP request, right? So what I'm going to do, I'm giving a breakpoint here, right? So what I'm doing here, I'm writing /student/details and I'm passing to, right? See, I'm get see who receives the request. Whenever the client sends the request, then which component is receiving that request? It is the controller and index or controller action method only going to handle the HTTP request. So in this case, whenever the client sends the request, right? This is the URL. Whenever the client sends the request, then it is the controller action method only going to handle the request. So in this case, as we are sending the request for the student/details action method, it is the student controller details action method going to receive the request. And whatever the ID you have passed, right? Currently, it is not getting the data, right? Because some issue, right, is there. I'll figure out. So, but we have outputted the data. So in this case, you can see it is going to work with the model component, right? So you can see it is going to get the data from the student business layer. It is going to creating an instance, getting the data from the business layer and handing over this data to the view. And then it is going to display the student data in the UI, right? So this is how your application is going to be work, right? So this is how the model, the controller and the view components are going to be used. Any question from anyone?
One question is there.
Yes.
Hello.
Yes.
If you give the different controller action name and the view, it will be bind or it will be.
See, I'm talking. So don't go with the different action method name, different controller method name, how this parameter is mapping, how it is executing. Don't go with such concept at this moment. So I'm just trying to make you what are the individual components, right? What is exactly a model? What is exactly a view? What is exactly a controller? How the architecture is defined, right? How the MVC architecture is defined, how they are communicating with each other. That is what I'm asking, right? So you can create any number of controller, any number of action method with the post, action method which get request, one action method with both the HTTP post and HTTP get request. You can select a view which is not which is present inside a different view. From one action method to you can redirect the request to another action method. Everything is possible, right? But I'm not going to discuss those things at this time. At this time, our main objective is we need to understand MVC design pattern. What exactly the component model, what exactly the component view, and what exactly the component controller. As part of a model, what are the things we can do? As part of the view, what are the things we need to do? And as part of the controller, what are the things we need to do? That is what I'm trying to explain. Clear? If anybody having any doubt related to these three terms or concepts, they can ask the question.
Sir,
Yes.
how does it know from this controller which view to? I did not get this point here. How is it?
Again, what I'm saying, that is not related to this model view control. How does it know, right? There is a routing engine. Routing concept is there. Engine will determine which controller, which action method to be executed, how to pass the data, right? So all these things are there, but not now. I'm not going to explain those concepts at this moment. At this moment, I'm just trying to make you is what are individual component, what exactly model is there, what exactly view is there, what exactly controller is there. Don't go in such depth that how it is deciding which controller, which action method to be executed. That is completely the part of routing concept. We will discuss those concepts in detail in our coming session. First of all, try to understand what I'm trying to explain. I'm trying to make you understand the MVC design part. What is model, what is view, and what is controller? How the controller instance is created, how the controller details action method is invoked, how it is mapping the URI data to this request parameter, right? All these things we are going to discuss, how the URL pattern is there, right? Or in this case, how it is possible that the student controller details action method is executed, right? How the URL pattern routing is defined here in this case, right? All these things we are going to discuss in details, right? But not now.
Hello, sir. So yeah,
Yes.
in this home controller, we have this student detail object that is the object of view, right? Sorry, model.
No. Yes.
And in line number 30 in view, we are passing the model object, right? So
Yes,
how?
exactly. We are passing that model object to this view.
Okay, so how it is speaking that view only for the student view?
See, so whenever we are using this ASP.NET for MVC framework, it is a convention over configuration. It follows the convention over configuration. If you do not specify any view name, right? In this case, I'm not specifying any view name. So by default, what it will do, it will go to the student folder, and inside the student folder it will look for a view with the name details.cshtml, and it will execute that details.cshtml view. This is the reason you can see this is my view folder. Inside view folder I'm having the student folder. Inside the student folder this is details.cshtml. So in this case, this return view statement means it is going to execute this details.cshtml view.
Okay. If we give other
This,
name, then
sorry?
we can give. If we give other
Yes,
name, not
any name you can give. You don't want to use execute this details view. You want to execute a different action view, right? A different view from a different controller. That is also possible. We'll discuss all those things in our coming session. Right now, I'm not going to explain such concept. Right now, I'm trying to make you understand is what are model, what are view, and what are component in your application. From the beginning only, I'm saying again and again, don't go with the code. Try to understand the concept first, right? Understanding the concept is important. Understanding the code is very easy, right? You can easily understand the code, but concept is important, right?
Sir, in the URL, what is that student, sir? Is that view or?
So again, I'm not going to discuss what is that URL, all these things, right? You are asking, I'm saying in this URL, this student is nothing but your controller name. This details is nothing but your action method name, right? This is your student controller, and this is your details action.
Okay, okay. So any controller, it should end with controller, right? Any controller
Yes.
name.
So we are going to discuss what is how to create a controller, what is the syntax, how many ways you can create, what are the different types of, right? You can we will use, why we should inherit from this controller base class, right? All these things we are going to discuss separately. I'm going to discuss model view controller in detail, but now I'm just trying to make you understand what is MVC design pattern and why you should use ASP.NET for MVC, right? So any question related to this three particular term, you can ask me. What is model, what is view, and what is controller? If you are not understanding how they are interacting with each other, if you are not understanding, then you can ask me the question. So what is the URL, how the data we can pass, how we can pass the request about all these things we are going to discuss step by step. Okay. Right. So this is how we have written, right? But the point that you need to guys remember, controller should be overly compiled by too many, should not be overly compiled by too many responsibility. What it means, The controller job is only to get the data, hand over the data to the view. And as part of a controller, you should not write any complicated or any business logic, any validation logic, right? You should not have such kind of things as part of your controller. Controller only to get the model data, to select the view, which view to render. Any business logic, any kind of a additional logic, you need to write them separately as part of your model, right? So
Sir,
now,
can we, sir,
yes.
can we separate the student business layer in a different folder?
Yeah, you can create in a different. See, I'm saying again, this model component, right? So what is the rules to follow while creating the controller? What is the rules to follow while creating the view? What is the rules that you need to follow while creating the model? Everything I'm going to discuss in detail. Don't worry about these things, right? You can create the models within the models folder. You can create a different folder there. You can put even you can create a class library project. There also you can put the models, right? You can put the model in one folder, in multiple folder, no matter. Yes, everything is possible, and everything I'm going to discuss also in detail,
Okay, sir.
right? So we have discussed MVC. Now let us try to understand what is ASP.NET Core MVC, right? The ASP.NET Core MVC is a lightweight, open source, highly testable presentation framework optimized for used with the ASP.NET Core, right? So this ASP.NET Core framework basically this is a framework which is a lightweight, open source, and highly testable. And you can use this ASP.NET Core MVC framework with the ASP.NET Core, right? And if someone asks you, sir, what is the difference between MVC and ASP.NET Core MVC? Can anybody tell me what is the difference between MVC and ASP.NET Core MVC? Whether both are same or both are different, or what exactly they are?
MVC Design Pattern, .NET Core MVC Framework.
Right. So MVC is the design pattern, whose main objective is separation of concept, means they will separate the model view and the controller. ASP.NET Core MVC is the framework which implement the MVC design pattern. Clear, guys?
Yes.
What is the difference between this Core MVC and MVC? Just
Core
open
MVC
source.
see, Core MVC and MVC means I'm not getting Core MVC and MVC. Have I mentioned anything anywhere Core MVC and MVC?
Sir, actually ASP.NET MVC and ASP.NET Core MVC.
Yes. That is what I'm going to discuss. Why you are in a hurry? I'm going to cover because I know I'm taking an interview. I'm asking this question. Definitely, I'm going to cover that as part of the session. Right? But before that, let me try to figure out what exactly MVC, ASP.NET Core MVC. So it is a framework which is lightweight and open source, and it is optimized to work with ASP.NET Core, right? So if you are working with ASP.NET Core, then you can use ASP.NET Core MVC to develop web applications using the model view design pattern. So basically, this ASP.NET MVC framework is meant to design, is meant to work with the ASP.NET Core, right? To develop model view controller pattern applications. So you can develop. ASP.NET Core MVC framework provides us with a pattern-based way to develop dynamic website, right? If you are not developing dynamic website, if you are only developing the static website, then don't use MVC design pattern. If you are developing dynamic data-driven website, right, where you want a clean separation of concepts, clean separation of components, then you need to use this ASP.NET Core MVC. The ASP.NET Core MVC provide us full control over the markup, right? Full control over the markup means you have the complete control, right? Whatever you can, if you look at this, it is nothing but we are using only HTML code, right? But as part of HTML code, somewhere we are using the C# code, but completely control the way you are developing the HTML, right? Same way you can develop and you can work, right? It supports the test-driven development, and definitely, if you work with ASP.NET MVC, then you know that test-driven development is possible in MVC. I mean in ASP.NET MVC. Also, it is possible in ASP.NET Core MVC. Why? Because each component is independent. You can test the model components, right? Business logic, whatever you have written independently. right? Also, it uses the latest web standard, right? So you can see HTML5, Bootstrap, jQuery, right? Everything, anything, right, which is generally used, right, to develop any kind of web application to give a good looks and feel, right? Everything you can use with ASP.NET Core framework. ASP.NET Core MVC is Microsoft Web Application Development Framework, right? Using this framework, you can develop web application, and it is a great in demand, right? Nowadays, most demanded framework which is used by .NET people for developing web-based application is ASP.NET Core MVC. It follows model view controller architecture. We have already discussed what is model view controller architecture. ASP.NET Core MVC was introduced by Microsoft uh, later part in 2015. So initially in 2015, this ASP.NET Core MVC was introduced. Since then, it undergoes some enhancements, some bug fixes, some functionality added, right? In each version, right? It was ASP.NET Core MVC 1.0 introduced in 2005, and currently it is .NET 7.0. So over the years, it has gone through many different versions. In each version, they are enhancing the functionality, adding a new feature, bug fixes, right? Removing some feature which is not required, which is very difficult for the developer to understand. So those kind of things they are doing in each. Guys, give me one. This is what you need to tell if someone asks you what is ASP.NET MVC. Now we need to discuss what are the features, right? These features you can relate with your ASP.NET MVC, right? So ASP.NET Core MVC, it is open source. Guys, is ASP.NET MVC is open source?
No.
No. That means what? If someone asks you what is the difference between ASP.NET MVC and ASP.NET Core MVC, then you can say ASP.NET Core MVC is open source while ASP.NET MVC is not open source. Clear first point?
Yes.
And I'm not going to discuss what is open source. Already we have discussed this thing, right? Cross-platform. ASP.NET Core MVC is cross-platform. ASP.NET MVC is cross-platform, yes or no?
No, ASP.NET is not.
ASP.NET MVC. Is ASP.NET Core MVC is a cross-platform? But I'm asking, is ASP.NET MVC is a cross-platform? Can you develop and host the application other than Windows?
No,
So
it's
this is
not a
the
class platform.
So this is the second point that you need to tell, right? Full control over HTML and HTTP. This is available means what I can say. This is there and this is also here, right? In MVC, the way you are writing the HTML and what I can say C# code, in the same way you can also write here in ASP.NET Core MVC, right? With ASP.NET Core MVC, you have completely control over the HTML you generate, right? That means you can simply create simple and complex HTML style using CSS and Bootstrap, right? You have full control over HTTP request that's sent between the server and the browser, right? Creating AJAX request is very straightforward, right? ASP.NET Core MVC is integrate client-side libraries, right? Like jQuery, Angular, React, and Bootstrap, right? But integrating React and Angular, right, with ASP.NET MVC is a little difficult, right? So, but integrating or developing Angular and React application using ASP.NET Core MVC is very easy, right? So, extensible framework means, this is also what I can say. This is also available in your ASP.NET MVC, and it is also available here. So view components is there, partial view is there, which you can create, and you can use any of other views. Tag helpers is there, right? Tag helpers means what I can say. This is the new concept which is introduced in ASP.NET Core MVC. In earlier framework, we are having HTML helpers. Even though HTML helpers is also available in ASP.NET Core, tag helpers are also available, which is the enhanced version, which will make your application to be enhanced in the future, right? For example, today you created the controller with some URL pattern, and from your view, you are accessing the controller. Tomorrow you change the URL pattern, right? Then even though tomorrow you change the URL pattern, you do not need to change the pattern in the view. View is only that much flexibility they are making your pattern, right? So that the tag, if you are using tag helper, automatically it will adapt to the new URL pattern, right? So this is the advantages of using tag helper. Even I'm sure you are not understanding what I'm exactly saying at this point, but once we discuss this tag helper, then definitely you will understand this routing concept. Is basically to URL pattern. You can say whenever you send the request, then how that request is mapped to the controller action method. That is what. Testing and maintainability means ASP.NET Core MVC application, right? It is an excellent choice if you want to develop a maintainable and a testable applications, right? So you can check each individual component of your application independently, right? The testing framework like XUnit, MS Test, MOQ, right? Those are available with ASP.NET Core, so that you can start developing the unit test project as well, along with your ASP.NET Core MVC to test each individual component of your application. Routing is there, right? Basically, why we are going to use routing means to make SEO friendly URLs, right? You can easily create SEO friendly URLs using the routing concept. API means you see all the C# concept, right? Right, like async await, multi-threading, parallel programming, asynchronous method, lambda expression, anonymous type, dynamic types, language integrated core, right? All these things, whatever available with your .NET framework, you can also use them with your API, right? With your ASP.NET Core MVC. Now, if someone asks you what is the difference, you only need to tell that most of the things are remaining same, but the only one major difference is that it is open source and it is cross-platform, and most of the things are going to be remain the same, right? So this markup syntax, right? Rather view engine available there, rather view engine also available here.
Sir, what are view components? Hello.
So view components means what? You can say those who are working. So partial view concept is there, right? So what exactly it means? So basically, you can consider it's like a view which can be used inside other views. So this view components you can consider reusable components, right? If you want to reuse some components, right, and you want to reuse that component in multiple views, then instead of creating that component in each and every views, you can create that view as a view component, and you can use that view component wherever or in whichever view you want. Clear?
It's same like partial views.
Sorry.
It's same like partial views.
Yes, exactly. That is what I'm saying.
So
This
view
is the reason
component is
why I'm not.
another name.
Sorry?
View component is another name for the partial view in .NET Core, right?
No, the name is same. I'm just mentioning. See, partial view we are saying, but what exactly the partial view represent? It's a component, reusable component only.
It's a user control, like user controls we have.
Yes, yes. Right. So now it is one of the interview question, right? When to choose ASP.NET MVC and when to choose ASP.NET Core MVC, right? Suppose you are currently working on an existing application and would like to extend the functionality by adding new features, right? You are working, so you are working on an existing application developed using ASP.NET MVC, right? And you want to expand the functionality by adding new features. Then in that case, you need to choose, or you need to, there's no other option than ASP.NET MVC. Suppose your team is familiar with ASP.NET MVC framework, but nobody has any experience on ASP.NET Core. And if you are having a team of 10 people, and nobody doesn't know ASP.NET Core MVC, but everyone is familiar with ASP.NET framework, then what you need to do? You need to go with the ASP.NET MVC framework, right? If you want your application will only be compatible with devices and servers that run on Windows operating system. Now, if you want to develop one application and you want that application should be only available or should be compatible with Windows operating system, not only from the development point of view, but also from the hosting point of view. I only want to use IIS server and I want to develop the application using only Windows operating system. Then in that case, you might be thinking about ASP.NET MVC framework, right? When to choose ASP.NET Core MVC? If you have a preference for utilizing a framework that is completely open source, right? If you want to develop one application and you want that I'm going to use a framework which should be open source, then in that case, you need to go with ASP.NET Core MVC framework, right? And you want one application to be developed and you want that application to be developed on any kind of operating system and you want that application to be hosted on any kind of operating system, then in that case, you need to go with the ASP.NET Core MVC. And if you are, and if some of your team member having knowledge of ASP.NET Core MVC, right? Even though they are having experience on ASP.NET MVC framework, if your team members having experience or knowledge on ASP.NET Core MVC, then you should choose to develop the application using ASP.NET Core MVC framework. If you are looking for an application framework that has a long-term development roadmap, right, ahead of it, then you need to use ASP.NET Core MVC. Why? Because if you see, while they are releasing the .NET Core framework, .NET 5, they have made a plan till .NET 10, right? So they are releasing .NET framework 5. They are making a roadmap that the next year, November, we will release .NET 6, then we will release .NET 7, then we will release .NET 8, then in the year 2023, we will release .NET 7, in the year 2024, we will release .NET 8, in the year 2026, we will release .NET 10, right? They have already made a roadmap. And if you want to use a framework that have such a huge roadmap, long development roadmap, then you need to go with this .NET Core, ASP.NET Core MVC framework. Clear, guys?
So what difference will it make if a framework is open source or if it is not open? So what difference will it make if a framework is open source or not?
See, if your framework is open source, then you will get the source code. And if you get the source code, and then you can make the changes and you can compile to your own version and you can utilize that. Nah? This is not possible with ASP.NET MVC. The source code is not available, but here the source code is available. Only before few days only, I have given the example how you can get the source code and how you can modify it as per your own requirement. All right, got it? Because see, clear now.